June 1944, 25,000 feet over western France. The sky is white fire, contrails twisting through blue haze, sunlight flashing off silver wings. The invasion below is only days old, and the air over Normandy belongs to no one. 8 P-47 Thunderbolts climb through thin cloud, their Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines howling like mechanical thunder. In the cockpit of the lead plane, Major Francis Gabby Gabreski glances at his gauges. Manifold pressure steady, boost climbing, oxygen flow good. The radio hisses in his ear. Bandits, high 12, diving fast. They appear like falling meteors. Fw-190s from JG-26, diving in from 30,000 feet, sunlight flashing off their shark-like noses. For 2 years, these planes had ruled Europe's sky. Faster climbing, sharper turning, deadlier than anything America could send. But that was before the jug. Gabreski's voice cuts across the radio. Wolfpack, hold altitude. Let them come. The German formation descends in perfect discipline. 8 radial engines scream in unison, cannon flashes sparkling like camera shutters. The Thunderbolts don't turn. They dive, just a few hundred feet, trading position for energy. And then, impossibly, they climb. The Luftwaffe pilots blink in disbelief. This isn't supposed to happen. Every German in Europe knows the Jug's reputation. Too heavy to maneuver, too sluggish to fight. A flying oil drum that can't possibly match the Fw-190's climb rate. But now, in the thin air over Brittany, the old equations are breaking. The P-47s rocket upward, their turbo-superchargers screaming as they feed high-pressure air into the engines. The Fw-190s try to follow and stall. At 30,000 feet, the formation splits. A German pilot curses into his mask. Verdammt! Sie steigen weiter. They're still climbing. Gabreski flips his jug into a half roll and pushes vertical, following a 190 through a barrel climb. The altimeter spins. The German tries to twist away, his controls stiffening. The American holds steady. A flash of light. 1 second of gunfire. 50 caliber rounds tear through the Focke-Wulf's wing root. Flames blossom. The 190 tumbles end over end, vanishing into cloud. Another one dives out, chased by a second Thunderbolt. At full throttle, the P-47 doesn't chase. It rises. Below them, contrails coil like smoke trails from artillery fire. The radio bursts again. 2 down. Break left, break left. Wolfpack, reform. High cover. The Fw-190s scatter, rolling into shallow dives, engines howling in protest. Their pilots can't understand it. The massive American machines, nearly twice their weight, are climbing past them with ease. The truth is hidden inside the Jug's fuselage, a labyrinth of ducts, turbines, and intercoolers that feed the engine with dense, compressed air. Where the German BMW 801 engine gasps thin air, the Thunderbolt breathes like it's at sea level. Physics, not myth, is now the weapon. Gabreski's wingman, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, loops through a cloud bank and comes out inverted. A 190 flashes beneath him. He fires, short and violent. The German plane disintegrates in midair, wings folding inward. Below, smoke columns rise from the hedgerows and beaches of France. The ground war is chaos, tanks bogged down, infantry locked in combat. But above it, the fight for the sky has already turned. Within 10 minutes, the Luftwaffe's so-called unclimbables are gone. The Jugs regroup at 25,000 feet. Their engines roaring steady, exhaust flames faint blue in the thin air. Gabreski looks out across the horizon. The Channel to the north, smoke to the south, freedom to the west. Wolfpack, he says quietly. That's what air superiority looks like. The Germans had once laughed at the Thunderbolt, calling it an overweight brute that could never match the elegance of the Fw-190. But up here, above the clouds, brute force is elegance. And the Jug has just rewritten the rules of the climb. The age of the unclimbable is over. In 1941, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 arrived over Europe, and the myth of German air superiority was reborn. When the first RAF pilots encountered it, The reaction was disbelief. They had never seen anything move like it. The Spitfire, McPhee, Britain's pride, could climb at 2,600 feet per minute. The new German fighter climbed at nearly 3,800. Its roll rate was unmatched. Its cannon armament, twin 20mm MG-151s and two 7.92mm machine guns, shredded anything within range. In early encounters, Fw-190s of JG-26 Schlageter cut through British formations like fire through silk. Pilots reported being rolled out of the sky before they could even react. The RAF temporarily halted daylight operations until a countermeasure could be found. The legend spread fast. The butcher bird, they called it. A fighter so perfectly balanced between speed, climb, and maneuver that it ruled every angle of attack. By 1942, the Fw-190 was the apex predator of Western Europe. Its design philosophy was pure German engineering minimalism. Radial power, high torque, thick wings, optimized for short bursts of violence. In combat reports, British and American observers described it as untouchable below 20,000 feet. Even the Luftwaffe pilots believed their own myth. To them, the Fw-190 wasn't just a plane. It was the embodiment of German craftsmanship, of control through design. When American bombers began arriving in 1943, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force, the Luftwaffe saw them as a challenge made for the 190. They had every reason to be confident. The P-38 Lightnings and early P-47s that escorted the bombers could barely reach German airspace. Their engines suffered above 25,000 feet. The Luftwaffe owned the climb, the intercept, and the disengagement. At least that's how it seemed. German commanders often said, "We may be outnumbered, but we are never outclimbed." That phrase, "never outclimbed," was repeated like scripture. It was a psychological edge as much as a technical one. It shaped tactics, morale, and propaganda. Then came a machine that didn't fit the pattern. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt didn't look fast. It looked like a mistake. Huge, round, overweight, a 7-ton cylinder of aluminum and oil. Luftwaffe pilots mocked it as the milk jug and the flying barn door. They didn't understand what was inside. The P-47's R2800 engine, paired with a General Electric turbo-supercharger, changed everything. It didn't lose power at altitude. In fact, it gained efficiency the higher it went. At 10,000 feet, it was equal to the Fw-190. At 25,000, it was superior. At 35,000, it was untouchable. But myths die hard. And in 1943, the Luftwaffe still believed it held every advantage. The Germans considered American fighters slow, unrefined, and wasteful. They saw them as proof of a nation obsessed with quantity, not quality. And for a time, they were right. Early Thunderbolts struggled. The first squadrons arriving in Britain found their planes sluggish in climb and ineffective above 25,000 feet, until pilots learned to trust the turbocharger, to stay fast and use altitude like a weapon. Inexperienced commanders misused them, sending jugs into low-level combat where the Fw-190's superior roll rate dominated. Losses were heavy, and German pilots laughed. But inside the 8th Air Force, a shift was brewing, led by men like Zemke and Francis Gabreski, who understood that the P-47 wasn't meant to fight the old way. It wasn't a duelist. It was an executioner. Once pilots learned how to use its altitude advantage, boom and zoom attacks, vertical spirals, power climbs, the Fw-190's supremacy began to fracture. Still, on paper, the numbers seemed in Germany's favor. The 190 was lighter, faster off the line, and deadlier in a turn. The jug was nearly double its weight and burned fuel like a bomber. But numbers lie when you only look at one axis. At 15,000 feet, the Fw-190 was a beast. At 30,000, it was a corpse. The myth of the unclimbable 190 rested on an illusion that air combat would always happen at low and medium altitudes within the machine's comfort zone. But as American bombers began striking deeper into Europe, the fight moved higher and longer. The Luftwaffe's advantage, precision, was about to meet the Allied advantage, production and adaptation. In 1943, the myth of German air superiority still ruled the continent. By 1944, it would burn out in the thin air over France. Because no matter how perfect the design, perfection dies when it can't breathe. To understand why the Thunderbolt defeated the Fw-190, you have to step inside the factories that built them. Because this was not just a duel of aircraft. It was a duel of civilizations. One side built weapons like art. The other built them like arithmetic. Bremen, Germany, 1941. Inside the Focke-Wulf assembly halls, the sound of hand tools and rivet hammers echoes across dimly lit floors. Skilled craftsmen, men who had once built airliners, bend aluminum by hand over wooden molds. They polish the curved cowling that would enclose the BMW 801 radial engine, 1,600 horsepower, 14 cylinders, air-cooled perfection. Every component is inspected by eye, every plane is tuned like a violin. The Fw-190A is compact, elegant, and ruthlessly efficient. It takes about 20,000 man-hours to produce, less than the Messerschmitt Bf-109, but still a product of artistry. Its designers, led by Kurt Tank, emphasize simplicity for field maintenance and performance at low altitude. The 190 is the ultimate knife fighter, built for the short war Germany expected to win. Farmingdale, Long Island, 1942. Across the Atlantic, the Republic Aviation Plant looks like another world. Rows of massive hangars hum with electric cranes, conveyor belts, and welding sparks. Women in denim coveralls move along assembly lines, installing turbo ducting and oxygen piping with clockwork precision. There is no artistry here, only repetition and scale. Each P-47 Thunderbolt requires more than 8,000 parts, most of them produced in separate factories across America. Engines from Connecticut, propellers from Ohio, turbos from General Electric in Massachusetts. Everything is standardized. Everything fits. In Germany, parts are matched by serial number. In America, they are interchangeable by design. One is a masterpiece, the other is an equation. And that difference would decide the war. When the Fw-190 first entered combat, it was the perfect machine for an air force at its peak. Lightweight, fast climbing, precise. But by 1943, Germany's industrial ecosystem was collapsing. Allied bombers hit power plants and aluminum smelters. Skilled labor was drafted into the army. Replacement engines arrived late or defective. Kurt Tank's design, once efficient, became fragile in the face of scarcity. Even minor production changes, new armor plating, heavier cannon, reduced climb and range. The Luftwaffe was trapped maintaining the illusion of technical superiority while its factories suffocated. Meanwhile, Republic aviation was scaling like a war economy on steroids. By mid-1943, one new P-47 rolled off the line every 90 minutes. The U.S. Army Air Forces could afford to lose hundreds and replace them without a pause. The P-47 itself reflected that abundance. It was massive, 18 feet wide, 30 feet long, weighing nearly 7 tons when armed. Its heart, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was a mechanical titan, 2,000 horsepower, 18 cylinders, and a turbo-supercharger that fed compressed air from a duct system running the entire length of the fuselage. That system was genius and insane. It made the Thunderbolt big, but it also made it unstoppable at high altitude, while the German BMW 801 engine gasped for oxygen above 25,000 feet. The P-47's turbo kept it breathing like it was still at sea level. In Germany, engineers optimized for elegance, fewer parts, lighter weight, perfect balance. In America, engineers optimized for persistence, power over polish, endurance over beauty. Those philosophies were visible in the pilots' missions. A German fighter might sortie twice a day, returning to refuel and reload. A U.S. P-47 squadron could sustain 4 sorties daily, rotating crews, aircraft, and maintenance teams in continuous cycles. Even the fuel told the story. German aircraft ran on 87-octane gasoline. The Thunderbolt drank 100-octane high-lead avgas, letting its turbo boost pressure far beyond what any German radial could survive. This was not just technology, it was infrastructure made visible in metal. The Fw-190 represented the height of what a struggling nation could do with precision engineering. The P-47 represented what an industrial superpower could do when it stopped believing in limits. By 1943, Republic Aviation's production output had tripled. Spare parts and engines were stacked in crates by the hundreds. Pilots joked that if you break a jug, they'll mail you 2 more. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was already cannibalizing old airframes for parts. Pilots of JG-26 reported flying aircraft with patched-together wings and worn-out tires. In every sense, altitude, fuel, materials, manpower, the curve had reversed. The Fw-190 was still lethal in the hands of an ace. But aces were becoming rare. Every loss mattered. Every destroyed factory rippled through the system. The Thunderbolt was designed to make losses meaningless. And that's what terrified the Luftwaffe most. Not the individual plane, but the idea behind it. That no matter how many Fw-190s they shot down, the sky would fill again the next morning. 2 factories, 2 philosophies. One built to win a short war, the other built to survive a long one. And survival, by 1944, was the only kind of victory left. Every warplane begins as a set of numbers. Horsepower, climb rate, weight, ceiling, roll. But in 1943, those numbers stopped being statistics. They became destiny. The Luftwaffe's Fw-190A5 was a masterpiece of mid-altitude combat. Its BMW 801D2 radial engine delivered around 1,700 horsepower and an exceptional climb rate of 3,800 feet per minute at 10,000 feet. It could roll faster than anything in the air, 160 degrees per second, and its dive speed in short bursts touched 410 miles per hour. But everything that made the 190 powerful had an invisible expiration point. The BMW 801's 2-stage mechanical supercharger could only compress air so far. Above 22,000 feet, the power curve collapsed. The engine ran out of breath. The Fw-190 could still climb, but only at 1,200 feet per minute by 30,000 feet. That was the altitude where American bombers lived. The P-47 Thunderbolt, by contrast, was designed to fight in the thin stratosphere where the Luftwaffe's engines suffocated. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800-59 radial engine, powered by a General Electric turbo-supercharger, delivered 2,300 horsepower even at 30,000 feet. Its climb rate at altitude 4,800 feet per minute, faster than any Fw-190 or Bf-109. The difference was invisible to the eye, but devastating in the air. When both planes took off from their bases, they climbed like equals. But by the time they reached bomber altitude, one was fighting gravity, the other was fighting physics itself. And physics doesn't negotiate. Let's break down the math of destruction. Fw-190A5, A8. Top speed, 408 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Power at 30,000 feet. 5,200 powers HP operational ceiling 37,000 feet. Roll rate 160 degrees 6. Weight 9,500 pounds. P-47D. Later D-25 variant. Top speed 453 mph at 30,000 feet. Power at 30,000 feet. 2,000 plus HP operational ceiling, 43,000 fuel watt. Roll rate, 100 degrees sec. Weight, 13,500 pounds. On paper, the German aircraft looked more agile. In reality, the fight wasn't about agility anymore. It was about altitude energy. The P-47's turbo-supercharger functioned like a secret second engine. It recycled exhaust gases to spin a turbine that fed pressurized air back into the engine intake. The result was power that didn't fade with altitude. The Fw-190's mechanical supercharger was a parasite. It stole power from the engine to make power. The Thunderbolt's turbo was a multiplier. It fed power without draining it. Every 5,000 feet higher meant another 150 horsepower advantage for the Jug. That's why the Luftwaffe called high-altitude engagements Kämpfe in die Luft dünn, fights in thin air. Because that's where the 190 died. In thin air, drag decreases, but lift and engine efficiency collapse. Every climb becomes a war against oxygen. Every throttle push becomes less effective. The Thunderbolt, built for that environment, turned scarcity into dominance. German ace Heinz Baer, who flew both 190s and 109s, admitted later, "Above 25,000 feet, the American planes had another gear we could not see. They could climb when we were finished." That invisible gear was the turbo, and it didn't just affect power. It changed tactics. A Luftwaffe pilot had one rule drilled into him: never follow an American fighter in a dive. The Jug's weight and aerodynamics made it descend like an iron bullet, over 500 km/h in a vertical dive without structural failure. Fw-190 pilots who tried to chase often saw their controls freeze as compressibility locked their elevators solid. American pilots knew it. They turned every dive into a trap. If the Thunderbolt dove, the 190 could either follow and die or pull up and lose the fight. If the 190 climbed, the Jug could climb higher. If the 190 dived, the Jug could dive faster. There was nowhere left to go. The Thunderbolt's combat radius with drop tanks reached 800 miles, almost double the Luftwaffe's short-range endurance. German pilots had 15 minutes of fuel for combat. The Jug had 40. Even weight became a weapon. The P-47's thick fuselage and armor gave it a survival rate unheard of in air combat. In 1943-44 over Europe, 56th Fighter Group pilots averaged one Thunderbolt lost for every 5 German fighters destroyed. The Luftwaffe couldn't trade losses like that. By 1944, Germany was producing only 400 Fw-190s per month, while the US was rolling out 500 Thunderbolts per week. But the most painful number wasn't in production, it was in altitude. At 32,000 feet, the Fw-190's climb rate was under 1,000 feet per minute. The P-47's was still over 4,000. That gap, 3,000 feet per minute, is the sound of air superiority. It meant the Thunderbolt could dictate every engagement: attack from above, disengage at will, return, re-engage. German pilots called it fighting ghosts, invisible enemies striking from unreachable heights. The Fw-190's myth of invincibility died not in dogfights, but in oxygen-starved climbs. Every engagement over France turned into the same pattern: the German plane trying to escape upward, the American overtaking it in the climb. The butcher bird couldn't breathe where the Jug thrived. By late 1943, altitude had become the new front line. And in that war, the Luftwaffe's perfection had no air left, because the math had spoken. The myth of the unclimbable was just another number that didn't survive the climb curve. May 1943, the first great meeting of the Thunderbolt and the Fw-190 over occupied France. The morning begins with gray clouds hanging over the English Channel, the air thick with the sound of bombers forming up. B-17s of the 8th Air Force, flying fortresses, climb slowly toward 25,000 feet, bound for a German target at Rouen. Below and behind them, 32 P-47 Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group, codenamed Zemke's Wolfpack, slide into escort formation. The pilots are new to this aircraft. Many came from P-40s or P-39s, light, responsive fighters that handled like sports cars. The Jug, by comparison, feels like a freight train with wings. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke sits in the lead aircraft scanning the horizon. On his instrument panel, the turbo boost gauge reads steady at 40 inches. Power ready. Over the radio, Wolfpack leader to all flights: stay above the forts. Altitude is life. Repeat, altitude is life. It's a new doctrine, one no one fully trusts yet. In the old world of dogfighting, pilots stayed low, turned hard, fought like gladiators. Zemke has taught his men to fight like engineers. Climb, dive, hit, climb again. He calls it energy fighting. Half an hour later, radar stations in southern England confirm what they've been waiting for. Bandits inbound, 40 plus, altitude 25,000. They're coming. The Fw-190s of JG-26 Schlageter, Germany's elite Western Front wing. These are the same pilots who humiliated the RAF in 1941-42. Many of them veterans of France and the Channel Front. Their confidence is absolute. At 27,000 feet, the contrails merge. The first German element dives in from the sun, cannon shells streaking through the bomber stream. A B-17's wing erupts in fire, then breaks apart. The Luftwaffe pilots bank sharply and climb away. The standard hit-and-climb attack they've used for years. But something's different this time. Instead of turning away, the Thunderbolts climb after them. The Luftwaffe leader, Hauptmann Klaus Mitusch, can't believe what he's seeing. He shoves his throttle forward, climbing steeply, expecting the heavy Americans to fall behind. They don't. Zemke's voice cuts in on the radio. "Wolfpack, keep your boost. Climb, climb." The jugs follow the 190s up through 28,000 feet, engines howling. Their superchargers feeding like lungs in a storm. The Focke-Wulfs begin to stall, their wings wobbling in thin air. The Germans roll inverted and dive, hoping to escape. Zemke pushes the stick forward. The jug dives like a sledgehammer. His airspeed climbs past 500 mph, faster than any 190 can safely descend. He lines up the lead Focke-Wulf in his sights, squeezes the trigger. 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns blaze for 2 seconds. The German plane explodes. Smoke and debris trail through the sky. Below, Gabreski's element rolls in from the right, diving through the German formation. "Break left. I'm on him." His rounds rake the belly of another 190, cutting it in half. A third 190 tries to escape by climbing, but the Thunderbolt behind him just keeps coming, turbo whining like a banshee. For the first time, the Luftwaffe discovers what American horsepower feels like. In less than 6 minutes, the engagement disintegrates into chaos. German radio chatter turns panicked. The 190s can't shake their attackers. Every attempt to climb ends in disaster. Their only option is to dive home. Zemke calls it off. "Wolfpack, stay high. Don't chase them into the flak." The Americans reform at 30,000 feet, smoke trails stretching behind them. Below, burning wrecks mark the French countryside. The bombers continue toward their target unmolested. When the Wolfpack returns to base that afternoon, mechanics count 8 confirmed kills, 2 probables, 0 losses. Zemke's after-action report is clinical. Enemy attempted vertical escape but could not maintain climb. Our aircraft retained power beyond 28,000 feet. Recommend all future engagements take place at or above this altitude. That single line changes U.S. air doctrine. In the weeks that follow, Zemke and his men refine the vertical war. They discover that the P-47, once dismissed as a slow-turning brute, is nearly unbeatable when flown by its strengths: altitude, speed, and firepower. The Germans never adapt. They can't. The Fw-190's airframe, optimized for mid-altitude, simply runs out of breath too soon. By July, the Wolfpack is claiming kill ratios of 4-1, then 6-1 against Germany's finest. One of Zemke's pilots, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, sums it up in his logbook. "They told us never to turn with a 190. Turns out we never had to." The Luftwaffe's advantage, its climb, its roll, its confidence, evaporates in those thin, cold skies. From that moment, the legend of the unclimbable begins to crumble. The Fw-190 may still rule the low-level dogfight, but that world is gone. The war has moved higher, into the stratosphere, into the realm of horsepower, where the Thunderbolt reigns. As the 56th Fighter Group taxis in at Halesworth that night, the ground crews cheer. The heavy, oil-stained monsters they maintain have finally earned their name, Thunderbolt. And Hub Zemke writes a single line in his mission diary before turning out the light. Altitude is life, and we own it now. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Western Europe had become a war of attrition disguised as a contest of courage. Each month, both sides fed more planes and more men into the same thin strip of sky between the Channel and the Rhine. But only one side could afford to keep bleeding. In the first half of 1943, the Luftwaffe still ruled that sky. Its elite wings, JG-26 and JG-2, flew almost daily against British Spitfires and the 1st Thunderbolt squadrons. For every American pilot lost, there was still the belief that the Luftwaffe's expert system, the aces who'd survived Spain, Poland, and Russia, could not be replaced. And for a few months, the numbers almost justified that faith. Then the math began to shift. When the 8th Air Force began large-scale operations in early 1943, U.S. fighters were losing one aircraft for every German kill. By the end of that year, the ratio had flipped, 2-to-1 in America's favor. By spring 1944, it was 5-to-1. The reason wasn't just new tactics. It was collapse by exhaustion. The Luftwaffe's elite groups were flying more missions than their logistics could support. Each Fw-190 required meticulous maintenance, 40 man-hours for every hour of flight. With Allied bombers hitting French rail networks and fuel depots daily, spare parts and aviation gasoline became precious. In November 1943, JG-26 reported that only 60% of its aircraft were operational at any given time. By February 1944, that number dropped below 40%. The rest sat on airfields, engines removed, cannibalized to keep a handful flying. Meanwhile, the Americans were doing the opposite. Every base in England, Boxted, Halesworth, Debden, Leiston, operated like a living factory. Ground crews worked in 12-hour rotations. Spare engines arrived by the crate. The P-47's modular design meant that a damaged turbo or propeller could be swapped in hours, not days. Every sortie the Luftwaffe flew drained its own future. Every sortie the Americans flew built momentum for the next. The loss curve, as Allied analysts called it, was the quiet mathematics of collapse. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,041 fighters on the Western Front. In February, 1,260. In March, 1,800. The number of trained replacement pilots arriving that same period? Less than 300 per month. By comparison, the U.S. was producing 2,200 fighters every month and graduating 2,000 pilots. It was not a duel anymore. It was a graph trending toward extinction. German ace Joseph Priller, commander of JG-26, complained in his diary, "We have only one way to win, to die perfectly." But the war no longer rewarded perfection. It rewarded endurance. Even fuel had turned into a weapon. American aviation ran on 100-octane high-lead avgas, thick, volatile, and energy-rich. The Luftwaffe's 87-octane synthetic fuel, made from coal hydrogenation, burned dirtier and weaker. It robbed the BMW 801 engine of power and lifespan. A P-47's turbo could sustain full boost for 15 minutes at 30,000 feet. The Fw-190s could last maybe 3. Each time a Thunderbolt engaged a Focke-Wulf, it could fight on its own timetable. Dive, climb, throttle back, re-engage. The German couldn't. One fight was a sprint, the other a marathon, and the result was predictable. By March 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence officers began seeing patterns in after-action reports. The phrase appeared over and over. Gegner mit Höhenvorteil. Enemy with altitude advantage. Altitude advantage meant life. It meant initiative, energy, control. The Germans could not build altitude anymore. Their bases were closer to the front. Their fuel was thinner, their engines tired. Even their pilots were breaking, not from fear, but from arithmetic. In the spring of 1944, a Luftwaffe replacement pilot averaged 160 flight hours before combat. His American counterpart, 450. Every new German pilot was fighting a veteran. Every new American pilot was joining a machine that learned faster than the enemy could think. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was mechanical. For every 100 Fw-190s produced, 20 were destroyed before delivery. For every 10 delivered, 4 were down for maintenance. For every 6 that flew, 1 returned damaged beyond repair. In the air, the results were visible. German formations that once attacked in disciplined waves now arrived scattered, smaller, uncoordinated. American radar spotted them long before visual contact. The Thunderbolts climbed high, met them head-on, and picked them apart. The Luftwaffe called it the death of mass. Where once hundreds of German fighters had swarmed in defense of Europe, now they arrived by dozens, thin, desperate, and hunted. For the Americans, each battle became easier to win and harder to feel. Pilots of the 56th Fighter Group began to notice. They were killing younger men every week, teenagers, cadets, pilots with 20 hours of flight time. Hub Zemke, always clinical, wrote in his logbook, "We're not fighting professionals anymore. We're fighting a dying system." By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe's collapse was visible to every soldier on the beaches below. Fw-190s made scattered, heroic attacks, strafing convoys, firing rockets, diving into cloud. Most never returned. The once unclimbable plane was now a symbol of futility, a magnificent relic burning in the same sky it had once ruled. The numbers had finished what courage began. And that's how every myth ends in modern war. Not with surrender, but with subtraction. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's kill ratio had inverted forever. The P-47 now owned the climb. The Fw-190 had become history in real time. April 1944, northern France. The fields around Saint-Omer are quiet in the early morning fog. Dew glistening on the hedgerows, cows grazing, distant artillery rumbling toward the coast. Beneath that calm lies one of the Luftwaffe's most important bases, the forward field for JG-26, home to the best Fw-190 pilots left in France. At 0600 hours, engines rumble to life. 20 P-47 Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group lift off from Halesworth, England, climbing into the mist. Their mission is codenamed Rhubarb Run, a low-altitude fighter sweep designed to draw out the Luftwaffe before the bombers cross the channel. The pilots know the odds. JG-26 has fought them for months. Disciplined, deadly, confident. But this time, the weather and the numbers favor the Americans. Leading the flight is Major David Schilling, Zemke's second-in-command. Calm, precise, his Thunderbolt painted with the name Hairless Joe. Over the radio, his voice is steady. "Wolfpack, climb and level off at 15,000. Let's go fishing." They fly southeast, the coast of France coming into view. Gray cliffs, patchwork fields, and narrow roads lined with poplars. Below, the black craters of bombed runways mark every Luftwaffe base from Calais to Amiens. At 0615, radar picks up movement. A formation of Fw-190s taking off from Saint-Omer. Schilling smiles. Hooks in the water. The Americans split formation. One flight climbs high, the other dives to the deck. Moments later, they see them. 6 Focke-Wulfs rising out of the haze, wheels just up, climbing in a lazy spiral. Schilling's voice snaps across the channel. "Blue flight, hold altitude. Red, follow me in." The P-47s dive. Engines screaming, propellers biting the air. At 400 mph, they hit the German formation before the pilots even level off. Lieutenant Robert Johnson fires first, a 2-second burst from his 850s. One Fw-190 explodes before its pilot can even close the canopy. Another rolls hard left and dives for the tree line. The Germans recover fast. The remaining Fw-190s break into tight rolls, using their low-altitude agility to evade. At treetop level, they weave through flak bursts and smoke. One Thunderbolt overshoots, nearly clips a church steeple. Schilling pulls up hard, climbs through 10,000 feet, rolls inverted, and dives again. His guns light up another 190 trying to bank into a vertical climb. "Got him! Splash one!" A second German dives straight down, trying to use the 190's superior roll rate to break pursuit, but he's burning too much energy. The P-47 behind him, flown by Lieutenant Walker Bud Mahurin, dives steeper, faster. The turbo keeps its thrust constant. Mahurin fires from 600 yards, hits the right wing root. The 190 disintegrates in midair. In less than 2 minutes, 4 Fw-190s are down. The survivors pull low, skimming the fields. The P-47s follow, heavy but relentless. Their 50s tearing through barns and hedgerows as they chase. Farmers dive for cover as tracers rip through the morning mist. At 500 feet, a German ace, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Mayer, tries to turn the tables. He banks hard, forcing his pursuer to overshoot, then pulls vertical in a desperate climb. It's a classic Fw-190 move. Bait the heavy American into a slow, rolling stall. But this isn't 1943 anymore. The P-47 behind him climbs effortlessly, its turbo roaring, its speed holding even as altitude builds. Mayer's plane stalls at 7,000 feet. The jug keeps going. Mahurin squeezes the trigger. 2-second burst. Flames. The Fw-190 drops like a stone, trailing smoke. Schilling calls, "All flights regroup at 10,000. The Thunderbolts reform over Saint-Omer. Below them, the airfield is chaos. Barracks burning, fuel trucks overturned. Smoke pillars rising. Mechanics scatter as 50 caliber rounds rake the runway. Schilling lines up one final strafing run, releasing a 500-pound bomb on a hangar marked with the Focke-Wulf insignia. The explosion rocks the airfield. Mission complete. Time to go home. The P-47s turn west, engines low, fuel almost gone. Behind them, the once proud base of JG-26 burns. Back in England, the mission debrief reads like a textbook. Enemy aircraft destroyed, 9 confirmed, 3 probables. Allied losses, 1 damaged, none lost. Duration, 43 minutes. The intelligence report that follows is even colder. Enemy reaction sluggish. Climb and intercept attempts ineffective. P-47 altitude performance superior in all regimes. But the human story lingers. That afternoon, Schilling walks through the hangar where ground crews are hosing blood and oil off his plane's fuselage. Someone's written in chalk beneath the exhaust stains. Jugs can climb. The myth of the Fw-190's dominance had officially died. Not in theory, but in smoke and debris scattered across the fields of Saint-Omer. For months, Allied pilots had been told to fear that name, that engine, that silhouette. Now they were the hunters. Hub Zemke wrote later, "The Fw-190 had been the Luftwaffe's best. By the time we met them over France, they were just targets with names." The duel that had once defined the air war over Europe was over in less than an hour. And for the Luftwaffe, every hour like that one pushed the line of collapse one step closer to Berlin. June 7th, 1944, D+1. The morning after the Allied invasion of France. Below the clouds, the beaches of Normandy are a storm of smoke and movement. Landing craft grinding onto sand, Sherman tanks churning inland, endless columns of men and machines spilling through fire and salt water. Above them, the sky is owned, almost by the Americans. Hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts patrol in pairs and squadrons, circling like metal hawks over the invasion corridors. Their wings gleam with invasion stripes, black and white bars hastily painted so ground gunners won't shoot them down. At 20,000 feet, Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski and his squadron of the 56th Fighter Group hold formation. His voice cuts through the radio static. "Wolfpack, tighten up. Watch the east. They'll be coming out of Paris in Dreux." Below, the rising sun reflects off the fields of Normandy. Patchwork farms, smoke columns, the wrecks of burning trucks and tanks. The Luftwaffe has been missing for 2 days. Many pilots assume they're broken, but Gabreski knows better. At 0812, the warning comes from radar. Bandits, multiple groups, bearing 170, altitude 2000. He grins inside his oxygen mask. Showtime. The dots appear against the rising light, a formation of Fw-190A8s from JG-2 Richthofen, supported by a few Me-109Gs. 40 enemy aircraft flying fast and low, aiming to hit the beachhead supply lines. Gabreski rolls his P-47 inverted, checks his position. Wolfpack, we're taking them head-on. Climb to Angels 25 and follow my lead. The Thunderbolts accelerate in a wide arc, contrails forming ribbons behind them. The R-2800 engines scream as boost pressure climbs past 50 inches. The Americans are heavier, slower to turn, but higher, always higher. The two formations meet over Caen at 26,000 feet. The sun flashes between them like a blade. The first pass is brutal. Gabreski opens fire from 600 yards, the 850s lighting up the sky. A 190 explodes in a fireball before it can roll away. Another dives through the formation, spraying cannon fire that rips through a P-47's tail. The American pilot ejects, parachute blossoming over the countryside. Then the vertical fight begins. The 190s try to climb through the Thunderbolts, banking hard, rolling into corkscrews. But the Americans don't follow horizontally. They go vertical, up through 28,000, then 30,000 feet, looping and diving in arcs of raw energy. It's a strange ballet of physics, the heavy machine rising faster than the lighter one. A German pilot later wrote in his diary, "They came from above like hammers. We could not follow them. We had no air left." Gabreski spots two Fw-190s diving toward the beaches. He pushes his throttle forward, rolls into a steep descent. His airspeed climbs to 480 mph. He overtakes them easily. One burst. The lead German disintegrates. The second tries to break into a turn but loses energy fast. Gabreski pulls vertical again, climbing back toward cloud cover. Uncatchable. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, his plane riddled with flak holes from yesterday, engages two 190s trying to escape over the river. They climb, he climbs higher. They stall, he fires. 2 seconds of firepower. One plane bursts, the other tumbles smoking into the trees. In 20 minutes, it's over. The Luftwaffe is gone again. 24 Fw-190s destroyed, 6 Me-109s, for 3 American losses. But the real impact isn't the kill count. It's what happens afterward. For the rest of the week, the Luftwaffe barely appears over Normandy. Their airfields at Chartres and Dreux are cratered, their fuel convoys bombed, their pilots exhausted. The P-47s own the sky. They fly nearly 1 to 200 sorties a day. Not just fighter sweeps, but ground attack missions, strafing German columns, blasting tanks, bridges, and trains. When the Wehrmacht tries to reinforce the front, the jugs descend on them like a thunderstorm. At low altitude, the Thunderbolts 50s shred half-tracks and trucks. At high altitude, its bombs and rockets carve paths through armored divisions. One pilot calls it the hammer of the invasion. The Fw-190, designed for tight duels, can't adapt to this new war. It was built to chase, not to endure. When it dives into the chaos below, it faces anti-aircraft fire, swarming Allied fighters, and the endless climb back through enemy airspace. By mid-June, most Luftwaffe pilots no longer attempt full combat. They strike once and flee. Many never even reach the beachhead. In an after-action report, Hub Zemke writes from his headquarters in Boxted. The Fw-190 was never defeated in a turn. It was defeated in a system. They can't replace what they lose, and we can replace it twice before lunch. The contrast is visible everywhere. German fuel convoys burned out on roads. American mechanics replacing engines in the open field with spare parts delivered overnight. German pilots sleeping in tents without oil or tires. American pilots eating eggs and coffee before their third sortie of the day. The air war over Normandy isn't romantic. It's mechanical, relentless, industrial. The P-47 has become the symbol of that machine. Not sleek, not pretty, but unstoppable. By July, even the Luftwaffe admits defeat and reports to Berlin. Enemy fighter cannot be outclimbed. Attempts to intercept bomber formations increasingly futile. Fighter command requests new aircraft with higher critical altitude. There will be none. The Fw-190A8, the best variant Germany can still build, is now obsolete. And the Thunderbolt, once mocked as too heavy for air combat, is now king of Europe's skies. From the beaches of Normandy to the skies over Paris, the war's balance has flipped completely. It's not the story of a single duel. It's the story of an empire realizing it can't keep up with gravity. The Luftwaffe built beauty. America built pressure. And at 30,000 feet, pressure always wins. By late 1944, the Fw-190, the butcher bird, had become a ghost of its former self. The fighter that once ruled the Channel front, that tore through Spitfires and Hurricanes, now struggled even to climb above the bombers it was built to destroy. Its defeat wasn't a single battle. It was a slow mathematical erosion, a war of pressure, altitude, and repetition that no amount of skill could stop. The Luftwaffe entered 1944 with roughly 2,200 operational fighters on the Western Front. By August, it had less than 600. Entire wings, JG-2, JG-26, JG-54, were shells of their former strength, running on fumes, fighting on hope. Every new engagement against the P-47 followed the same cruel geometry. The Germans saw them first, dived, attacked, and climbed away. Then the jugs came up, always faster, always higher. What was once dominance became desperation. German ace Heinrich Stör, a veteran of 250 missions, later said, "We could not fight them on their terms. The Thunderbolt was a machine of another war, a war of engines, not of men." That statement is the obituary of the Luftwaffe's legend. The Fw-190 was born in an era that still believed mastery could overcome mass, that a perfect pilot in a perfect machine could decide a battle through instinct and precision. But modern war had moved on. The Thunderbolt represented the new logic. Climb higher, hit harder, repeat forever. When the first P-47 squadrons arrived in 1943, the Luftwaffe still laughed at them. Too big, too slow, too American. By the end of 1944, they feared them more than anything else in the sky. Because the Jug could not be intimidated, and it could not be outrun. The key was altitude, but the truth was infrastructure. Behind every Thunderbolt was a chain of miracles. Refineries, factories, convoys, fuel depots, engineers, and pilots rotated through a training pipeline so vast that it turned air power into production math. The Fw-190 might win a duel, but the Thunderbolt won systems. Each time a German ace shot one down, two more crossed the channel before dusk. Each time an American pilot fell, another took his place, trained, rested, supplied, and waiting. This was not the romantic sky of 1940. It was an industrial sky, a place where horsepower mattered more than heroism. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots were gone. Their replacements were boys, many with fewer than 100 hours in a cockpit. Their 190s rattled with wear, engines running on synthetic fuel that burned too hot and too dirty. In one report from JG-2 Richthofen, a mechanic wrote, "We are flying machines that no longer belong in the sky. The enemy climbs over us as if gravity itself is on his side." Gravity was on his side, because power is gravity when it comes in the form of a turbocharged engine. The Fw-190's design, optimized for short-range interception, had met its evolutionary dead end. It couldn't fight longer, higher, or faster. It was the perfect knife in an age of artillery. The P-47, meanwhile, became the workhorse of Allied victory. By late 1944, it had destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft, 9,000 locomotives, and 80,000 trucks and vehicles in Europe. The Luftwaffe wasn't just beaten. It was erased from logistics upward. And yet, for all its brutality, the Jug was never elegant. Its pilots joked that it climbed like an elevator, dived like a meteor, and landed like a brick. But that brick was indestructible. German pilots learned to recognize it by sound. The deep, resonant roar of twin turbo exhausts echoing across the sky. When they heard that, they didn't stay to fight. They looked for clouds, for cover, for any way down. Because by 1944, altitude meant death. The war of skill had turned into the war of endurance. The Fw-190 had mastered the former. The P-47 had defined the latter. By the time Allied troops crossed the Seine, the myth of the Luftwaffe supremacy had vanished with the smoke of its airfields. And in its place stood the new doctrine of the industrial age. Speed is power. Power is altitude. Altitude is survival. The Thunderbolt proved that you could win a war without grace, just with pressure, process, and persistence. When Germany built the Fw-190, it built the best of yesterday. When America built the P-47, it built the first machine of tomorrow. The unclimbable Fw-190 had finally been outclimbed, not by luck, but by the cold logic of turbocharged inevitability. Zemke summarized it best in one line of his 1944 combat diary. "We didn't beat the Luftwaffe in the air. We beat them on the charts." And those charts, horsepower, altitude, range, were no longer equations for engineers. They were epitaphs for an empire that believed perfection could replace production. By the end of 1944, the sound of the sky over France had changed. The roar of radial engines, the flash of tracer fire, the metallic thunder of the P-47, all of it had become the background music of Allied victory. The Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was a rumor. The Fw-190 had entered the war as a masterpiece. It ended it as a monument, a relic of a nation that could design brilliance but couldn't sustain it. The Thunderbolt, the flying anvil, had done more than defeat it. It had replaced the very idea of how air wars were fought. Power had beaten precision. Altitude had beaten instinct. Systems had beaten skill. And in that transformation, modern air power was born. By early 1945, the Jug had become the workhorse of the Allied advance. It flew escort for bombers, strafed rail yards, obliterated tanks, and silenced artillery. Over the ruins of France and Belgium, it became the sound of inevitability, a turbine-powered drumbeat announcing that the Reich's days were numbered. Even German civilians came to recognize that sound, deep, heavy, inescapable. They called it Donnerkeil, Thunderbolt, not because it struck fast, but because it struck again and again. The myth of the unclimbable had become the reality of the unstoppable. But as the Allies pushed toward the Rhine, a new silhouette began appearing among the contrails. Sleeker, faster, more elegant. The P-51 Mustang. Where the P-47 had won the war through brute force, the Mustang would finish it through precision. Longer range, cleaner lines, and the Merlin engine that gave it both speed and grace. Together they were the two sides of victory, the hammer and the scalpel. Zemke's Wolfpack, now veterans of hundreds of sorties, transitioned to the Mustang by spring of 1945. But even then, Zemke insisted that the Thunderbolt had set the standard. The Jug made us professional. The Mustang made us perfect. The lessons of that evolution were clear. You don't win wars with legends. You win them with logistics. You win them with altitude and endurance. The Luftwaffe had never understood that. The Allies did. And they built an air force that could outlast any myth the enemy could invent. By VE Day, the skies over Europe belonged entirely to the United States Army Air Forces. Of the 16,000 P-47s built, nearly 14,000 were still operational. That statistic alone says everything. Machines broke, systems endured. The war that began with Knights of the Air ended with assembly lines in the sky. The Fw-190 was the last of its kind, a sword in a world that had discovered the gun. The P-47 was the first of a new breed, the industrial fighter, the weaponized equation. And that equation, horsepower times altitude times repetition, became the new law of combat aviation. But even as the last Thunderbolts rolled back to their English airfields, something new was already stirring in the hangars. Sleek silver prototypes with engines that didn't roar but screamed.